A very warm welcome to Marina Wheeler to the 9th Lahore Literary Festival, who's joining us from London in lockdown. Hello, Marina.
Hello, Nelofar.
Marina, I'd just like to give a short introduction. Marina is a barrister and a Queen's Counsel, and she has a specialization in human rights law, and this is her first book. Marina, The Lost Homestead, My Mother, Partition, and the Punjab, is a memoir of your mother's life in a fabled land of spice and saffron where the sun never seemed to set on the British Empire. You pay homage to your mother, and in doing so, you confront what you call an uncomfortable heritage. Tell me, what compelled you to confront this, what you call an uncomfortable heritage, and why did you use those words to describe your mother's life in colonial Punjab as you were paying homage to her life?
Wonderful question, Nelofar. Can I just say before I embark on answering it, just how delighted I am to have the chance to talk to you and to all of your listeners. Just to say, I first went to Lahore in 2018, and at the time I went, I think I was just after the Literary Festival, and thought to myself how wonderful it would be to be able to take part. I wish I was with you there, but we're all making the best of the situation we're in. So inshallah, some other time I will be there. Why I decided to embark on writing my mother's story really goes back to 2017, and that was the 70th anniversary of independence and what the British call the transfer of power. And it was an event that created a lot of interest here in the UK. And in watching some of the coverage with my mother, it just brought home to me very strongly that she had been there. It seems extraordinary to think that I might have forgotten that, but you know, being a child, I think one also sometimes fails to appreciate that a parent has a hinterland. At that time, among the commemorations was also a film that you may know, Gurinder Chadha's Viceroy's House. And I saw that film, I was asked to review it in fact, and was quite astonished. It portrayed a historical account that didn't completely resonate with me, and I was curious to know, and I think that just stoked a curiosity. I should say it stoked a curiosity because empire being a difficult subject in the UK meant that I really knew much less about it than I ought. I was very aware of that. So I think that was a large part of inspiring me to settle down and have a look. And I think the second part was just my mother, I was very aware, was not getting any younger. Mm. And I wanted to be able to hear her account before it was too late. But I was wary because I know it's a very sensitive subject that is difficult to talk about. I think I wasn't quite prepared for how controversial it still is in each of the countries, the UK, but also India and Pakistan. And that was another feature of what was so interesting for me, was being able to see the different perspectives from both India and Pakistan. And I think to that extent, I was very fortunate to be able to move between the two.
Yes. And so as you put pen to paper, as it were, Marina, you must have realized that your account, or rather your mother, Deep's account of colonialism was going to really go against the popular tide, because the narrative had shifted somewhat. And here I'll just pick out two passages from your book that kind of talk about the paradox in talking about colonialism. So you write, Shashi Tharoor took part in an Oxford Union debate and demanded Britain pay reparations to India for colonial wrongs. His witty and eloquent speech was viewed some 5 million times. Narendra Modi enthused that it reflected the sentiments of the citizens of India. And on the other hand, you, on a more personal note, you write about your own take on colonialism in your own family. And you write, perhaps in this generation of my family, anger about empire has dissipated because, let's face it, Britain is less important than it was. It may also be because my nephews and nieces have spent time in Britain, and Britain has changed. It is multiracial. Racial. So tell me, how were you able to confront and straddle these paradoxes? Because on one hand, you have this very inflammatory narrative of the likes of Shashi Tharoor, and on the other hand, your own personal take on the narrative, as it were.
Yes, well, I was very keen to try and embark on the whole project with as open a mind as possible. I understood that because my grandfather had been very close to the Raj, and I deal with that in the first few chapters of the book. He was a medical doctor who held various positions conferred on him by the Raj, and became, through his association with the British, well off. And of course, I was aware that, you know, the language that's used nowadays, at least in, well, I'd say much more in India, I think, than Pakistan, you know, is that of collaboration, and that's what makes it uncomfortable. But I had this sense, I think reinforced by watching the Gurinder Chadha film as well, that with the passage of time, our understanding was not getting deeper. It was probably becoming increasingly two-dimensional, and maybe that does happen with history. But I felt that it would just take some effort for me to try and bring back some of the nuance into the discussion. And so I think what I did was I tried my very best to, in a way, act like a barrister. In fact, that's not quite right, because we are advocating a single position as barristers. But I suppose the reality is that we tend to represent both sides. So, for example, I've represented the government and I've acted against the government. So here I was trying to take a step back, and I hope that I've done that and not become too embroiled in adopting one position or other. I think I've tried to really just convey, as I say, the nuance, but also convey where the points of difference arise, and maybe a little bit why.
And yes, you do, in the very, as you mentioned at the very onset, try to set the stage, as it were, of colonial Punjab and the way the Sikh community especially was being integrated and assimilated into the British Empire after the annexation of the Punjab in 1849, prior to which there had probably been a century of turbulence with the collapse of the Mughal Empire and petty princely states coming up because of territorial rivalries. And of course, the most important successor state being the kingdom of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, which the British overcame. And I will revert back to your book again, and again, your perspective or your family's perspective on this integration, as it were, of the Sikh, demobilized Sikh soldier peasantry into the Raj. You write, although defeated, the Sikh army had been a formidable foe, as Papaji was wont to say, and the British respected it. No sooner was it disarmed than it was, in effect, called on to help. And then you go on to talk about the vital intervention on the part of the Punjab in quelling the armed uprising of 1857, and how this further sort of stabilized Punjab. And you write that the rebellion quashed, The Crown assumed direct control of India from the East India Company. The Punjab had saved the Raj and thereafter was a favored province. Soldiers who had fought were rewarded with permanent employment in the British Indian Army. So there's a palpable sense of pride in service to the Crown. It wasn't something that was as a result of intimidation, but integration. What would you have to say to that?
I think that I am aware that there are very different views about the degree to which involvement with the regime, the Raj, was by choice or by intimidation. And I think, having pondered over this for a while now, I think I feel that Patrick French's description of the structure of the Raj as being, in a sense, a joint venture between the elites of the two countries does resonate very strongly with me. And I think that that is the experience when I look at my own family, that, you know, they saw the British, and I'm not going much further back than my grandfather because I have very little access. In fact, I have zero access to anything further back than that. But from there, I think that the situation was that they saw the British were the rulers. And as I say in the book, I think my grandfather's perspective was that in his immediate locality, they seemed to rule pretty efficiently as he saw it. And he wanted to be a part of that in order to serve his own community. And I don't think there was much presence, British presence, in my mother's life, as far as I could tell from her account. And certainly as she grew up, more and more power was being transferred to, Indianization, as it was called then. So those around her tended to be Indians who had positions of authority within the Raj.
I am getting the sense of where you're taking this. And in addition to that, the seismic events that were taking place in Punjab at that time, I mean, it is a fact that it did become a favored province with the Raj. Yes. And most of the soldiers, the Sikh soldiers especially, were being integrated into the British Indian Army because, one, with the intervention in the quelling of the uprising, and then with the establishment of the canal colonies. Now, this was probably the most profound influence of the British Raj in the Punjab that helped to perhaps not quell, but it certainly gained great economic advantages for the community. So, in fact, from 1885 up till the end of the British rule in 1947, excluding the princely states, the land under the canal colonies went up from something like 3 million acres to 14 million acres. And thousands of migrant workers were being brought into this area. And within a span of just about 50 years, you see a very hard landscape being completely transformed into one of the biggest irrigation systems in the world. And so when we talk about integration, that's what I meant, that there was a whole policy of integration that was taking place. And again, I will take you back to your wonderful book, because you talk about the accounts of that time of the area where your mother's family belonged. You write, the Shahpur Gazetteer described the place where Deep grew up. It recounted in lyrical, self-congratulatory prose how building the lower Jhelum Canal transformed the surrounding area. These irrigated areas, known as canal colonies, were linked together by postal and telegraph systems, railways and roads. The Northwestern Railway was extended via Sargodha, and from there, huge quantities of wheat, cotton and sugar were sent south to the port of Karachi. So it seems like an entire sort of juggernaut had been unleashed. And your grandfather was very much at the forefront of this great change.
Well, that's very true. And I have to say that for me, that was learning about that was quite a revelation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know it's thought that in the UK, we have a very sort of romantic idea of empire, but that certainly wasn't the way that I was brought up. I mean, I had quite a liberal education, and I think the usual thing that you learn is, as far as I was educated, there was more emphasis, I think, on atrocity and apologizing for having imposed this, system on an unwilling people, as of course they became. But so that meant that for me, in a way, it was really fascinating to hear about, as I said, this life from my mother, in which British people didn't really appear very much, but also to the extent as she spoke of it, and as her father saw it, that they were held responsible for bringing a great degree of prosperity and order to the area. And I think also education. And that was the other thing that I think was an absolute fundamental part of my mother's upbringing and my grandfather's focus. And I do talk in the book about my mother's school in Sargodha, which, it was mixed. In a sense, there was a curriculum that had British elements that left her completely bewildered. But the important point was that there was good provision of schools with an emphasis on languages. I mean, they spoke English at school, but also Urdu. And then she learned Punjabi at home. So I think that's the other element of her account of her pre-partition life in Sargodha, was this ability also for different communities to live together side by side. And that I think, as she saw it, the British, because in her life, they were not very present, there was a sense of just enabling. Mm-hmm. I mean, I in the book do paint in chapter 1 the picture that is, I can recognize, perhaps slightly idealized from her account, and then move on to chapter 2, where the picture starts to become a little more murky as all around the world, ideas of self-determination are taking root, and there is the beginnings of huge change and upheaval.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, at this moment, of course, when we're talking about these seismic changes taking place, the hometown of your mother, Sargodha, is actually, it comes up. And it's wonderful to think and to read in the book about the beginnings of Sargodha, because as you well know, when you visited Sargodha, it's a bustling city in Punjab. It's the 12th largest city in terms of population, and yet one of the very few planned cities in Pakistan. Lailpur, which is now, of course, known as Faisalabad, was one, and so was Sargodha. So it came up as a canal colony. It came up as a very conscious decision on the part of the Raj to bring about a new kind of a village, villages that were more civilized. There was more hygiene, there. So that is a wonderful thing to read in your book, how it's a city which is now so big and bustling was just there. It was just beginning in its infancy.
Well, it's so interesting you asking me that in that way, because it's such a I found that in the British Library when I first went to start researching this, and Nelofar, you've read a passage from the book that I quoted from the Gazetteer, which was written in this lyrical style, and it was so interesting to see that. But as I was reading it, I was thinking, you must bear in mind that this is written by colonialists, and you must bear in mind that they are very keen on bigging up their own project and so on. And I think that was a reflection of, how much we have been taught to, to be skeptical and to put it in its perspective. But nonetheless, I think what did come through very clearly was that there was a cadre of not very many British, but a cadre of British who were there, who were, my mum always used to underline this, very well qualified and educated, who went because they knew it was an enormous challenge trying to, to govern such a huge and complicated country. But they went, and I think, by and large, what comes through in the Gazetteer as well is a real dedication to the job, which is not to say that there wasn't, violence and force used, because of course, there was. But I certainly think that for people like me, educated here, it was interesting to see a glimpse of the daily life, beneath, I think, all of the, the anger and, I suppose, the polemic about empire. And I think it helped to understand that. And it also, of course, was interesting to see, and this is when one looks at sort of gains and losses, about how power was being transferred during the 30s and 40s. And how much of a struggle it was to try and accommodate the different minorities in the Punjab, but of course this applies throughout the whole of India. And perhaps that's pushing us on a bit, but to my then understanding of the, the cataclysmic results of the country being divided, the appalling loss of life. And I think my understanding of that was much enhanced by having an appreciation of the way that the different communities that coexisted in the 30s and 40s, then once democracy came, found themselves jostling for power and feeling insecure about whether their interests were going to be protected.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you do remark or muse rather that the historical memory and how it selects, distorts, and deletes, and it seems as if in the course of the book you're taking it upon yourself to somehow right some of the distortions, to do away with these preconceived notions, or maybe the distortions that have now come into the narrative. And over here, again, I'll go back to your text. You talk about the British saw landowners like Papaji as the natural leaders of this rural feudal society. The Raj gave them positions of responsibility and co-opted them into government. In 1923, they formed the Unionist Party, drawing support from peasant proprietors and Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim agricultural tribes. This meant that in the Punjab, the main political division was not between Muslims and non-Muslims, but between landed and commercial interests. So you're trying to find a place back into historical accounts of certain portions of history that seem to have been redacted or just been obliterated or deleted from historical accounts. And the Unionist Party that you talk about is one such institution, perhaps, which was really a cross-communal caucus in 1923, as you write, with the common interest of landed property being just the very common interest. What would you say about that?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it goes back to my point about history becoming more simplified as we move further away from the events. I think, the bright lines develop and all of the shade disappears rather. And I do feel that about 1947, about Indian independence and partition. The British came and simply drew a line. I'm coming to Radcliffe here, drew a line of division. I mean, I mentioned the Gurinder Chadha film. She advances the quite esoteric notion that that was something that the British considered to be in their interests, which I think I fairly roundly discovered was quite simply not the case. But I think that certainly in finding the nuance, yes, I wasn't aware before about how complex the political makeup was in the Punjab. I don't think I understood that the eventual settlement was agreed by the Indian leaders. I mean, I'm referring to Gandhi, more Nehru, but Jinnah among them and Baldev Singh was agreed because an all India settlement seemed to be an imperative for both the Indian leaders and the British, who of course were exhausted after the war. But I think in that, there is no real appreciation of the complex problems that existed in the Punjab and existed in Bengal as well. And I think also maybe not an appreciation of why Jinnah and in the creation of the Muslim League came to a point where there was real fear about how the Muslim minority would fare in a Hindu majority India. And so I think that was never something that was explained in the, you know, I mean, and I've been quite frank about knowing very little, but the films that one saw about these events, whether it was Gandhi or Gurinder Chadha's film, I don't think ever really properly grappled with why. You know, it would have Jinnah popping up and suddenly saying, I want Pakistan, but not really helping anyone to understand what the impulses were behind that.
Mm-hmm. And the partition of Punjab also, again, a history that seems to have been written out of the narrative of what was actually happening in Punjab because of the economic gains being given to the people. The Punjab bourgeoisie didn't really have any reason to oppose the British rule as such, because till about the late 1930s, there wasn't any real nationalist figure that came out of Punjab. The elections of 1937, 100 out of 186 seats of the Punjab legislature were won by the Unionist Party, again, which was a cross-communal caucus made up of Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims. And the question of Muslim and non-Muslim, or this whole concept of divide and rule, just never seemed to catch the imagination of the people, the enfranchised people of Punjab, who seemed to not want to throw off the yoke, as it were, of the Raj, but were just happy to keep on pulling themselves out of poverty and towards prosperity.
I mean, I think it's absolutely right that the really striking aspect of the Punjab was this cross-communal arrangement that unionism represented. But I suppose, one has to remember that the enfranchisement, and when I was talking about the slow introduction of democracy, that still by 47, not much of the population was enfranchised. I mean, we were still looking at a small elite that the British had co-opted into the government. So in that sense, yes, it still was a very small group that was ruling. And I guess, as all over the world, that couldn't continue forever. But I certainly got the sense from my own family as Sikhs, and from their perspective, that the British were seen as was seen as a way to hold the, to sort of hold the balance between different communities. And, it wasn't democratic in the sense that we understand it, of one man, one vote. And that there were times when it was necessary for the British to, say, appoint members of the legislature, Sikh members of the legislature, because they were a small minority. But I think that all that just goes to underline for me how this issue of how do you incorporate a minority, protect a minority, incorporate it into a bigger sort of political structure. I mean, it's just a problem that was there and caused ultimately, appalling bloodshed. But it is a problem that remains with us all around the world and that we still grapple with. And that as well is why I think this partition experience is so relevant still to global affairs.
Yes. So within the narrative of the book, we hear your mother's voice that keeps coming in as a sort of a voice of an oracle, trying to right some of the wrongs or put things into context, as it were. And there's a very nice discussion that she has with you about Lord Curzon, and of course this whole system of primary education and the fact that she was educated in Urdu in her school. And you also refer to the much maligned Macaulay in your in your text, and I'll just quote a little line from that. You say, Macaulay didn't aim to keep the population in submission. Who knows, he wrote, where this education will lead. It may develop the notion of self-rule, and that is what happened. The fathers of Indian independence developed their political ideas in English. Mostly they spoke to each other in English. Then they turned to their erstwhile masters and exposed the hypocrisy and illegitimacy of colonial rule. So it's very interesting how you kind of put things in perspective that had perhaps one hadn't seen that in that light before.
Well, I'm glad you think that I did that, in that I certainly set out to do that. And I think that I was very struck because that passage, the preface for that is that I asked some of my Indian nieces and nephews in Mumbai and Delhi predominantly about their feelings about the Raj and about independence and so on. And I got some interesting answers back, and it was there, in fact, from a couple of them, where Macaulay was first mentioned. And I have to say, in all of my life, I've given Macaulay no thought at all. And, it was one of these things of then just thinking, really, who is this? Why is it that this figure from, I think, predominantly the 19th century is getting so much airtime, in a sense, in modern India? And it was from that I saw, he uses this phrase, I'm not sure I can remember it completely, but it's a rather disparaging phrase that he uses about comparing Western literature with, I can't remember if he calls it indigenous, but it's a phrase that you read now and you wince reading it, as I say in the book. But the point is that is an utterance, I think, of the time. The point that he was also making was about the need for more modern education. And I think moving away from a focus on religious education to embracing maybe, more scientific ideas as well. And I was saying there that, in fact, I had taken this from there had been a debate within the Indian press, I think, about Macaulay, but saying, is he an angel or devil? And I commented then that seemed a sort of binary choice between the two. And I think, as with so much, I came to the conclusion that, it's swings and roundabouts. There's light and dark and shade in between. And I think I'm trying in the book as far as I can to always bear that in mind.
Mm-hmm. And one of the most major distortions, in your opinion, come up when you are talking about Jinnah. And this is where the line comes in when you mention Jinnah and you say, I thought also about historical memory, about how it selects, distorts, and deletes. And then you say, M.A. Jinnah is a case in point. Jinnah is all but forgotten as an Indian nationalist. Western films paint him as a villain. So tell me about that. And there's a very nice a very pensive, kind of a poignant sort of description about going to see his house in Bombay.
Mm. Well, of course, also my understanding, in inverted commas, of Jinnah also came from my mother, who had lost her home at the event during Partition. So she also used this phrase about Jinnah as an evil genius. I think it was coined in the immediate aftermath of independence. But that's how I had grown up. And so, of course, it was really fascinating to discover Jinnah's early role in the independence movement, what a passionate advocate he was for Indian independence. Of course, I was fascinated by his training in the UK at the bar, by how secular he was as a young man, cosmopolitan. All of that was very interesting. And then I think what struck me as well, and also how he differed so much from Gandhi as being a constitutionalist. So he was very much the lawyer who seemed to believe not in, convening large demonstrations and, burning clothes. He thought that was all rabble rousing. So I found that really fascinating. But then the whole shift from him being, as I say in the book, an ambassador for Hindu-Muslim unity as he starts out, to ultimately being an advocate for separatism, was something that I felt, warrants greater understanding. And, I can't possibly do justice to what's been written about that as a subject, but I just touch, I think, on the book and a few thoughts, Ramchandra Guha, for example, who speaks about, the complex motivations that many politicians do have, but his from being a genuine change of view. And I think this particular point about his doubt that the Muslim minority would be protected within a majoritarian Hindu country was a dominant concern. But then, Guha also picks up some of the more human elements, such as feeling sidelined by Nehru and Gandhi. And I think as well, I was trying in the book to develop that understanding of some of these great historical figures as human beings with complex motivations and aspirations. And also, I should say as well, I think another great lesson, and this applies to Jinnah too, is also often their inability to keep control of what it is that they have set in motion. And I think, that the events in 47 are a very strong case in point.
You do present most unconventional rationale when you are trying to come to grips with something like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. I don't know if it's the lawyer in you, but you somehow connect the dots of the massacre to India's present-day treatment of the issue of Kashmir. And there's a very pertinent passage here in your book. What happened at Jallianwala Bagh in 1919 was the state using excessive force against protesting civilians. As Amnesty International and other human rights organizations will confirm, this remains a pressing issue in India today. The context is the Indian Army's use of force in Kashmir. how did you connect the dots to coming to an understanding of the British, the event, this horrible event in British colonialism, to the present day scenario of India's treatment of its Kashmir issue?
Well, as I say in the book, I was thinking about that event, Jallianwala Bagh, on the centenary of, on its centenary in April 2019. And I had written a draft article for a newspaper in which I tried to first acknowledge it as absolutely as an atrocity, a massacre, without any, I don't think there's any possible justification for it. I mean, there's been some interesting recent historical accounts about it in trying to understand how it came about. But, indisputably, it was a horrendous, unprovoked attack on, as it turned out, unarmed civilians. And I think what I was trying to do was to acknowledge that as an event that I don't think, certainly here in modern Britain, there's much debate about. But then to go on and say, but what lessons can we draw from it? And I think that's where we get into the, the controversy, because I was arguing in my draft article that the British now, well, the British are no longer in India. That was the first and most important point. They do use their forces around the world. They deployed, as you know, in Afghanistan and Iraq recently. But when they do that and things go wrong, they are, broadly speaking, and I accept there may be some debate about this, but there are mechanisms by which they're held to account, and that is usually in the courts. And it was then that I felt that there was some lesson to be drawn more broadly about accountability and the use of force globally. And because we were talking about India and we were coming up to an election in India, it seemed to me very relevant to touch on something that I know is very controversial in India. And I think in a sense, that's the point, which is that we all find it difficult to look at our own, the faults of our own country. And that's what really led me to say, do you in India really look closely at what Indian troops do in Kashmir? And do you apply the same sort of standard of rigorous scrutiny as you might be doing to a historical event? That's what prompted me. I have to say, I had a lot of arguments about it afterwards with members of my family, but I'm not repentant about raising the question.
Great. So let's change tack a bit and talk about your travel to Pakistan when you arrived in Lahore and you encountered a city that you said was very similar to Delhi, in that the colonial and the Mughal architecture intermingled, and you saw tangible proofs of memories that had been recounted to you of places like the Conned College, where your aunts had studied, and Government College, where members of the Sikh community, and of course, Khushwant Singh you mentioned. And tell me something about that. How was it coming to a place like Lahore and seeing in brick and mortar the kind of the places spoken of so lovingly by, you talk about your aunts sort of keeping up their friendships across borders with reunions. And even though partition was especially hard on students at Connect, because in suddenly all of the Hindu and the other communities emptied out of the hostels and left never to return.
Yes, I mean, I have to say that it was only really once I started on this journey of writing and researching the book that I think I appreciated how important institutions like Kinnaird had been, because my mother didn't go. She had left Sargodha when she was 14, so she never had the great privilege that her two older sisters had had to go. But it was only after starting to research this that I understood how that experience, and for them, they had never forgotten that great sort of flowering of freedom that they felt at Kinnaird and in Lahore, and their, particularly my aunt Anoop's love for Lahore and for the school and for friends that she had made there. I mean, she, by the time I started doing this, she could no longer communicate. So that sense I really got from a film that one of my nieces had recorded of her talking, which in itself had a certain magic about it, because she had become inaccessible to me in a sense because of her age. But there was captured in this film her love for the place. And I have to say, as I grew up and growing up here in the West, the last 10 years, I suppose, have sadly, when one is talking about Pakistan, been dominated by, just one or two subjects, like, for example, security and terrorism. And what I found so wonderful and enriching was being able to get behind that, which is not to brush it aside entirely as an issue. And I know that, security problems have borne very heavily on Pakistanis too. But I think that was the joy of coming there and seeing that. And again, the literary festival that I'm so pleased to be able to be a part of. The people I met in Lahore who just introduced me to so much of the culture that had been completely behind closed doors, and the museum, which in the book I refer to as a jewel, which it is. That is something that, yes, I hold very dear.
And take us down to when you visited Sargodha for the first time. Your account in the book is initially very upbeat. You're accompanied by your son, and you go around, and it seems that you're really happy to be on the same piece of earth where your mother and all of her family lived, and there's a very nice touching passage in the book when you're searching for the Lost Homestead. And there's this really nice scene where, if I can just read it out because it's lovely, you write that after a short time, so many people are involved in the search, and there are so many opinions about what the map means and where the house might be, that I stand back to take in the scene. This is Sargodha. A collection of curious locals are all trying to puzzle out where Deep may have lived in an earlier incarnation of this place. It is slightly surreal.
It was surreal. I mean, I kept having to pinch myself, I suppose, because this is a place, as we touched on earlier, where time really has moved. And the description of the Sargodha that my mother grew up in felt like a million miles away. I mean, I don't think it's a great plot spoiler to say that the home that she had described as paradise, I found no longer existed. And I was very struck by the starkness of change. But I found that what ultimately mattered to me was not really whether I found the house or not. What I think mattered, though, I found ultimately, was that I was able to identify some kind of, I suppose, a mark of my grandfather's presence there so many years earlier. And that came in the form of finding, although not the Lost Homestead, finding what was back in the 30s, the first female hospital in Sargodha, which he had helped to found. And I had with me just this photograph of very few things that he had, or that I had managed to, historical things that I had. I had this photograph of the opening ceremony of that hospital with the British governor of the Punjab and his number two, my grandfather, and then the local bigwigs of the time, the Tivana family, in all their resplendent turbans. And that was the document in a way that became quite central to my journey to Sargodha, because with the help of a wonderful, warm academic at Sargodha University, he helped me to find the hospital. And then I was able to present them with a framed copy of this photograph. And I found that did matter to me. It mattered to me that I was able to see something tangible that my grandfather had been a part of, and something that was good. And that rather goes back to some of your original questions, Nelofar, I think, about him doing things that he felt were serving his community. I mean, the hospital was built to help women survive childbirth. It wasn't any tribute to the Raj in any sense. So yes, as I say, that gave meaning to the journey.
Mm-hmm. And you do sort of say that at a point in your visit to Sargodha, you find it's leading nowhere. And you do say that perhaps a point comes where it is right to close the door on the past. I'm startled by this idea. I sound like my mother. What was going on in your mind when you wrote this and when you felt this in Sargodha?
Well, I'll take two elements to that question. First, my mother, because I think, the great dominant thing about my mother's handling of this traumatic event from her past, of losing her home and relocating to another place, Delhi, where she ultimately settled, was that it was an event she essentially blocked out of her life and blocked out of memory. And after they left Sargodha, my grandfather's edict was, we will never talk about what we left behind and what we lost. So they didn't. And that was part of why I understood so little about it. So her great technique of coping, I think, in life was to bury things. And I think, and that was really what I was thinking at that point then, when I was traipsing around Sargodha looking for this house, and underline that it was really my desire to go rather than my mother's desire for me to go that took me there. As I was traipsing around, and then afterwards, having discovered that it was no longer in existence, I was delving into this question with the help of some friends who I had made, delving into the question of, well, what happened to it? Who owned it? And I was getting different answers. And then I just came to this realization that the detail of it didn't matter. The broad fact of it being lost in unhappy circumstances was all that was needed. And I think this is a very important and profound sort of question about history generally as well, and painful events from the past is, at what point do you let go? And, in a sense, that also was part of my thinking about Jallianwala Bagh in 1919. And I don't know, there isn't a simple answer to it. I think it's something along the lines of needing to recognize the truth of what happened, but that a point comes where you don't keep scratching away at the scab of it. You let it heal and you move on. And I think that's, what I believe. But it's easier said than done.
Yes, indeed. You do leave us with this question in which you say that should we judge history by the motives of its protagonists or by their results? which is I find very telling.
Yes, I mean, all across, I absolutely don't pretend to have any answers. And I think it probably comes through in the book, or I hope it does at least, that is very much myself grappling with some of my own attitudes and misconceptions and preconceptions. But I think just coming away with this sense of always trying to check oneself and to keep an open mind and be willing to listen. And that, comes back to the India-Pakistan, sadly, yes, division. And the fact that I was so struck that that division seems to be getting more pronounced, at least in the time that I'm looking at it, more pronounced than less. And I think part of that is simply that opportunities for exchanging ideas for human to human contacts, going back to Kinnaird, the fact that people can't get visas and that it's not my aunt anymore, but her daughter would love to go back to Kinnaird as they used to every year for the reunion. No chance of getting a visa these days, and that's a very destructive development, I think.
Thank you so much. And with this, we conclude this lovely session. Thank you so much, Marina. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nelofar.